Good afternoon, everyone. Really wonderful to see such a beautiful crowd here for a very special afternoon's program. First, I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to make special thanks to First UU Church, which has been kind of a second home to us over the years. It went dark. I might just pick up my piece of paper. Back up, okay. Has been a second home to us over the years. We've had lots and lots of events. By we, I mean Richmonders for Peace in Israel-Palestine, and that's RPIP, and the Arab American Association of Central Virginia with Adib Abed as president, and he's here somewhere. There he is, okay. And special thanks to Rada Hudson and her newly formed organization here at the church, the Palestine Awareness and Advocacy Group at First UU. Today's program is very special for all of us. I really want to tell you how important Miko Peled was to me personally as I began my journey away from the misconceptions that I had as a lifelong member of the Jewish community. I was pretty much uninformed about Israel until I attended a book discussion here at First UU back in 2013. We talked about Sandy Tolan's book, The Lemon Tree, and that was the beginning of my awakening. As a result of that, I turned first to Jewish authors, Jewish scholars and authors. I read the early warning words of Albert Einstein and Martin Buber. And then I found Miko Peled's book, The General's Son, in which he described his own early years as the son of Mati Peled, the Israeli general who was responsible for the capture of the West Bank in the 1967 war. Most of you know, or if you don't know, you will by the end of today. Following the war, Mati Peled insisted that Israel return the land to the Palestinians. He understood the perils of maintaining an occupation, and when no one in the Israeli government would listen to him, he resigned his position and spent the rest of his life in pursuit of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We in Richmond today have a unique opportunity this afternoon to hear from Miko Peled himself. Miko will tell the story of his being raised in this very prominent Zionist family with both his father and grandfather as leading figures in Israel's political military elite. He will describe his journey from his early Zionist influences to become someone who was able to break clear of the lies that had shaped his childhood and emerge as one of the leading voices in calling for justice for Palestinians. Miko is a strong supporter of boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. He's a contributor to several online publications, and he's been invited to speak all over the world, even in Richmond, Virginia. Whenever he is speaking, Miko takes the opportunity to advocate for the creation of the democratic state, one democratic state with full equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. Miko is founder and president of Dar al-Hurriya, the Palestine House of Freedom on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is a new Washington-based nonprofit organization dedicated to educating Americans about Palestine. We are just really honored and thrilled to have Miko in our midst this afternoon to speak to members of our Richmond community. There's more. I also want to introduce to you our moderator and my dear friend, Philip Farah, Dr. Philip Farah. Philip was born in East Jerusalem in 1952, 4 years after his family lost everything they had and joined the majority of Palestinians who became refugees, barred from returning to their homes by the new state of Israel. Philip came to the United States in 1978 at the age of 27. He recently retired after a 35-year career as a public sector economist. A founding member of the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace in 2000, and then the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace in 2012, he has spoken widely on Middle East peace and justice issues. Philip recently joined the board of the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, VCHR, and he just was in Richmond 2 weeks ago to advocate with VCHR at the General Assembly. Philip has relatives in Gaza who were among those murdered in the ongoing Israeli genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. So I would like you to hear first from Philip, who will give his perspective on life as a Palestinian living under Israel's repressive government. And Philip will share some of his story with you, and then he will continue with the conversation with Miko. So, Philip?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for the church for having us, and thank you all for coming. Like Nancy said, my family are originally from Gaza. 3 of my grandparents are from Gaza. My father was 14 when they left Gaza. They moved to Jerusalem because Gaza, that was back in 1917 that they left, and Gaza was totally destroyed by the British and actually the defending Ottomans. That's a story unto itself. And Gaza always has a way of coming back like a phoenix. So my father and uncles and aunts were all baptized at a church called the Church of Saint Porphyrius in Gaza, an Orthodox church. It's reputed to be the 3rd oldest church in the world. Has been rebuilt many times, but it's still a very old building, beautiful, beautiful church. And very soon after the genocide started, in October of 2023, the whole Christian community took shelter at the 2 churches, actually 3 churches, but especially the 2 big ones, St. Porphyrius, my family's old church, and the Church of the Holy Family, a Catholic church. Now, Israel bombed that church, St. Porphyrius, and 18 Palestinian Christians sheltering there were killed. Fortunately, the church was damaged, but largely intact. It is being rebuilt now. And several of my relatives from the Tarazi family were killed, were among the 18. One of the survivors, Ilham Farah, a cousin of my father, was 84 years old. She was a beloved music teacher in Gaza, taught several generations of Gazawis. She survived that bombing. She moved to the Church of the Holy Family because, you know, the memory of the bombing of St. Porphyrius was very heavily weighing on her. So she moved to the Catholic Church. After several weeks, she just wanted to go home, check on her home, and get a change of clothes. Everybody told her not to because it was she would be hurt, probably shot. And indeed, she was shot. She was shot in the leg, and she bled and bled for many hours. She was on the phone trying to get help from the Red Cross, and she was on the phone for hours bleeding, and nobody could reach her because anybody who was trying to get her was shot at, and so nobody could reach her. The next day, a tank went over her, we learned, and we are not sure whether she was still alive or dead already. And it was only quite a while after that that they were able to retrieve what was left of her remains. So, and still some of my relatives, this was covered, by the way, all over the media. The few instances where, the coverage was truthful. You know how bad the media has been on Palestine, on what's happening in Gaza especially. But even the Vatican made a statement about this. But there are relatives of mine, and this is, part of the story, and I'm sure that Miko will address it. There are the people who have been killed with the bombs and with the snipers. And, there were 2 people in that church where she ended up moving, the 2 elderly women who were shot inside the church by the snipers, inside the church. And so that's the people who are killed with the bombs and with the missiles and the drones. But then there are the people who are dying because of lack of food, because of lack of medicine. 2 of my relatives, Evelyn Farah and Siham Farah, they died, one of them in the arms of her son, who was a doctor, who could have easily saved her if he had the medicine. But because of Israel's siege, she passed away. He couldn't do anything to save her. I myself have experienced not nearly the same kind of horror, but I was in an Israeli prison under administrative detention, and I was beaten up, asked to confess to totally fabricated stories. And I was there under administrative detention, and really because administrative detention means that you don't know what the charge against you is. You have no right to even know what the charge against you is. And, but I think of all the prisoners now who are being released, under the exchange program, under the exchange agreement. How many of you see Al Jazeera or Democracy Now? Yeah, please do not go to the mainstream media only. See the horror that these prisoners are recounting about their prison experience. What I experienced was nothing compared to the torture factories that are the places where they have imprisoned tens of thousands of Palestinians. There's hardly a Palestinian growing up under occupation who has not been in prison. Hardly anybody. Certainly males and many females as well. My wife was even imprisoned. So this is part of the story. I don't want to take more time. Please, Miko, come over and let's start the conversation. I just want to ask folks here, when we finish the conversation, if you have a community, a mosque or a church or any other community that might be interested in taking a pledge, it's called the Pledge for an Apartheid-Free Community. Come and talk to me and I'll give you one of these cards. Thank you. Salam, Miko. Miko and I drove together, and it was a very special occasion for us to learn more about each other. So I'm going to read my questions because they're kind of involved. Miko, you grew up in a family who included major figures in the establishment of Israel, closer than anything to Israeli royalty. But you have basically disowned this heritage. Some of the people here may have not read your book, so could you please tell us your story?
There are people here that haven't read the book? That's outrageous.
Shame on them.
That's outrageous. Well, first let me thank Nancy and everybody that's helped out to put this event together. Thank all of you for spending this glorious day indoors to come and discuss Palestine. When people ask whether or not there's hope, this is what hope looks like. When so many people decide to, when so many people decide to take a beautiful afternoon and rather than enjoy it outside, come inside to discuss Palestine and ways to, ways to free Palestine. And thank you, Philip, for the ride and for the company, and we've known each other for many years, and for this great story that you just told. And it's true, I was born into this family of Zionists, very patriotic. I always say I didn't learn about Zionism from a textbook or a college course. You know, it was every day at the dinner table and at family gatherings. And it's very interesting, especially now, to connect the dots. Because I think what we're seeing now, and as I recall back, things I heard and things we discussed when I was a child, there's a direct link. There's nothing unique about what is happening now in Palestine. There's nothing unique about what is happening in Gaza now. And there's nothing unique about the discourse. So like the title of my book says, The General's Son, my father was a general. And he was one of the generals of the 1967 war. I had I had other members of the extended family who also held very important positions in the Zionist movement leading up to the establishment of the apartheid state and then running the apartheid state for decades, and the military arm of the apartheid state. And because of the unique situation, this really effective segregation that the apartheid state was able to put in place, when you grow up in that environment, when you grow up in that space, that's what you know. And that's really what segregation is for. What's interesting is that they were able to create such an effective segregated system in such a small country. Because you could I grew up in Jerusalem, right? And they call it a mixed city, a united city. There's nothing mixed or united about the city of Jerusalem. It's completely segregated. Completely segregated. So our neighborhoods, the Jewish Israeli ones, were segregated from the neighborhoods, and we discussed this, of the children of Arab Jews who came to Palestine. We were segregated from them. And of course, all of us were completely segregated from the Palestinians. So you could be living across the street across the street from a Palestinian town, and the reality is completely different. How many people here have been to Palestine? Can I see a show of hands? Oh, quite a few. How many people here are Palestinian? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. And so you grow in this thing, and you think, I always say I thought I was born and raised in a place called Israel. Turned out I was born and raised in a place called Palestine, but in a space within Palestine that is so colonized and segregated that you think that that is the reality. So in a way I was born an Israeli and I was liberated by Palestinians, by Palestine. And that was my good fortune. And so and then at one point in the journey, because the subtitle of the book is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, at one point in the journey, I realized that I had to make a choice. You can't go on and hold on to these so-called truths, to this racist ideology, to this violent reality, this complete justification of the violence, and yet think that you believe in human rights and peace and all that. I mean, you have to pick a choice. to put it more simply, you're either a racist or you reject racism. You can't, there's no middle ground here. There's no, and so I had to make that choice, and I'm obviously thankfully I made the choice thanks to really the support and the gracious, warmth of Palestinians who became my friends and colleagues, and more than friends and colleagues, brothers and sisters. Thanks to them, I was able to make that transition and maintain some semblance of sanity while I was doing it. And here I am today. And I'll just say one more thing about that. The connection between, I've been doing a lot of interviews lately, and this is the kind of question that comes up a lot. And as I look back at the reality in which I grew up and the conversations that were taking place and the very clearly stated and declared goals and objectives of the Zionists, what we're seeing today is a materialization of those objectives. What we've seen in Gaza over the last year and a half is not unique. And anyone here, and I know that there are people here who are victims of or survivors of the Nakba of 1948, this is a continuation of that. There's been no end to that Nakba. And this is, of course, a heightened reality of that same phenomenon, but that's really what it is. And so I think it's really important to see that. A lot of people sometimes say, well, Israeli society, it's become more extreme, it's changed, it wasn't like this. It was like this. Maybe they didn't express themselves as bluntly as they do now, but this is not anything different than what Palestinians have been experiencing for the last almost 100 years.
So you wrote your book in 2012, and please buy the book. It's excellent.
There's a test.
And a lot has happened since. But, especially for people who watch the mainstream media, you really don't get the right picture. So can you give us your view of what the most important things that are happening since. Of course, there's the apocalyptic destruction of Gaza, but there are many other things happening in the West Bank. And can you please kind of give us some picture of what you see? And in Israeli society as well.
Sure. So the book came out in 2012. Then, precisely because of what you described, we did a second edition in 2016. And then we did the final edition, and I think it's the final edition. We did a 10-year anniversary, and it came out at the end of 2022, or beginning of 2023. And because things are developing, things are changing, and so there was a lot to say. And it's also a memoir, so it's an update about that as well. I think that from what I'm seeing, the one thing that is probably either, if not the most significant, but certainly one of the more significant things that have happened over the last decade, is that people are realizing that Israel means what it says, that the Zionists are not kidding around, that the Zionists never had, never will, and certainly don't currently have any interest in this idea of peace or coexistence or anything like that. And I think 10 years ago, people were still somewhat perhaps living in this illusion that there could be some kind of a two-state solution, there could be some kind of a coexistence with the Zionist state. That the Zionist state was open, there were elements within the Zionist society and the Zionist states that were open to some kind of a dialogue or peace. And if anything, if we've learned anything over the last 10 years, is that never existed and certainly does not exist. And so we need to go beyond that. We have to go beyond that. And that's a conversation that I have with people all the time, even Palestinians. We say, yes, but if we tried harder, but if we spoke some more, if we had more dialogue, and meanwhile Palestinians are being killed wholesale. And it's not just the fact that they're being killed. Palestinians have been living under a reign of terror for almost 100 years. So how much longer do they need to suffer? And how much longer are we going to wait so that one day Israeli society will wake up and decide that, they want to make peace? I mean, it's not realistic. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely irrational. So I would say certainly that is one major thing that I hope has changed is that people are realizing what we saw over the last year and a half in Gaza was predictable and preventable, because we could have had this, we could have stopped it. And a wonderful journalist in Gaza, Farah, who was targeted and killed a few months ago, I knew her, she interviewed me, I interviewed her on my podcast. We've known each other for several years. She was targeted and killed along with her children and her husband. And when I heard the news, I looked back at some of our exchanges on WhatsApp. And about a year before that or so, she wished me a happy birthday, and then she said, so what do you think is going to happen? And we're kind of, chatting, and I said, if the international community doesn't intervene, and soon we're going to see a catastrophe the likes of which we have never seen. And it's going to happen in Gaza. And sadly, the international community, as we know, did not intervene. And people are, again, talking about this like, oh my God, what is going on and why is it happening? This was predictable and it was preventable. And the attempt to pretend that Gaza is unique, I mean, Gaza is unique, of course, but it's not unique in the sense that it's a part of the rest of Palestine. And it's a part of the entire reality that exists in Palestine. Palestinians are living under a reign of terror everywhere in Palestine, in the Naqab, in the Galilee, in Jerusalem, in Jaffa, in Haifa, everywhere, in the refugee camps outside of Palestine, and so on. And Palestinian voices are being silenced here in this country. So this is not, we have to see, if you see the whole picture, then you can see it's only going to get worse unless we stop it. So again, I think that's probably the biggest change that I've seen, that I'm hoping took place.
Quick follow-up, because, October 7 is when it all started, is really the message of the mainstream media. But, there was the series of pogroms in Huwara and other places, and the desecration and provocation of that was happening, the desecration of the Aqsa Mosque, and also the fact that the Israeli army was not so keen anymore on protecting the southern part of Israel from Gaza, because they kind of ignored it, and they had everybody up there in the north protecting the settlers from from the Palestinians, when they should have. So the things that kind of led up to October 7th and what's happening now, the pogroms were causing a lot of Palestinians to move voluntarily away from their towns. And what's happening now in the West Bank? And some people think of it as, a continuation of the genocide.
Yes, well, it is all part of the genocide. There's no question. The genocide didn't start on October 7th, like you say, even though people tried to pretend that it did. It didn't start on October 7th. The genocide has been going on for almost 100 years. And it's this attempt to try to separate Palestine based on the Zionist construct. So the Zionists chopped Palestine up and created different bureaucracies to govern different parts of Palestine. But that's not Palestine. That's not the way Palestinians see it. Palestinians are Palestinians, whether they're in Gaza or in the Naqab or in the Galilee or in the West Bank. And by the way, there's no such thing as the West Bank anymore. It's just a figment of people's memory. It's been completely integrated into the rest of, the apartheid state, with big cities and highways and shopping malls for Jews only all throughout, except for, and this is how the Zionists describe it, they have pockets of hostile population within that area. And that's 3.5 million Palestinians living in ghettos. That's really all that's left of what used to be the West Bank. And now what we've seen these settler gangsters, many of whom were just released from prison, from an Israeli prison. In other words, these gangsters were so horrific that even the Israelis thought they need to go to jail. And the bar is set pretty low there. So they released them, and of course we're seeing these you know, the pogroms, I think is probably the best way to describe it, these riots, these attacks on Palestinians everywhere. And the vision is to get rid of all the Palestinians by choice. And how do you create that choice, or that, you know, leave them wanting to leave, as you make life hell, and so they don't have a choice. Although if you see the videos coming out of Gaza after this very miserable announcement by Trump that he's going to take over Gaza, if you watch on social media the videos coming out of people in Gaza, first of all, it's uplifting. It's amazing that you can watch people in Gaza and feel uplifted. But they're basically, do you know who we are? You think you can come and get rid of us? Yani, bring it on kind of thing. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Watch it. I've been listening and posting and reposting some of these videos because they're phenomenal. And some are more serious, some are more funny, some are, you know, kids singing, all kinds of things. But across the board, they're saying, you're out of your mind if you think you can come and get rid of us. But yes, it's all part of the genocide. I mean, there's the former Minister of National Security, the convicted terrorist Ben-Gvir, who's a, you know, is a gangster thug. He, just before he left, just before he resigned, he stated very proudly that he alone, in his tenure, which was not very long, gave 200,000 licenses for weapons to Israeli settlers, as though there was a lack of weapons in Israeli society. Everybody's got weapons, and he's given 200,000 more licenses. What are they going to do with these guns? What are they going to do with these weapons? There's only one thing they do with these weapons, and that's kill Palestinians. And then he was very proud of the fact that he managed to, and the word they use is maintain governance, or establish governance in the Naqab where Palestinian Bedouin live. And governance means home demolitions are up, land confiscation is up, and so on and so forth. And arrests of Palestinians is up. And so he's very proud of that as well. So the apartheid regime and the genocide take different shapes slightly in different parts of the country. But it's all part of the same thing. It's the attempt to kill and destroy and get rid of the Palestinians in every way that they possibly can.
My next question, you probably have already answered most of it, about this being continuation of the Nakba of 1948. But part of my question is also the role of the US and the Western powers in actually the ongoing Nakba today.
Yeah, well, it's our tax dollars. We're paying for this. So I believe this very strongly. I think anyone who lives in this country who does not get up every morning and do everything they can to stop this is complicit. Because we vote for the representatives that vote to send the money and the guns and all the other weapons. We vote for them. In other words, they owe their seats to us. And if they feel comfortable doing this, then we just haven't done our job. We haven't. So I think we need to get up every morning and figure out and make sure we do everything we can to make it stop. And we have to, broaden the circle. We have to make sure that other people realize this as well. And one of the missions that we took on when we established Palestine House of Freedom in Washington is to do just that, is to be, we're not a lobbyist, we're 501c3. But our objective is to put out the most robust education out there, the most robust means for people to understand what is going on. People talk about, if you talk to politicians or generally people who, they say, well, we need stability and we want peace and we want democracy, but what are you going to do? It's a tough neighborhood and these are Palestinians and So let's take a moment here, okay? Why is there instability? Why is there violence? There's an apartheid regime that is responsible for the instability and the violence. If anybody cares for stability and democracy and ultimately peace, first of all, clearly it's the Palestinians more than anyone else, but you have to remove the obstacle. And what is the obstacle? It's glaring. It's looking right at all of us. It's the apartheid state. It's the apartheid regime. And what's an alternative to it? A free, democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. That's the alternative. We were just at the falafel place where they had the sign up there, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's that simple. There's nothing complicated about a free Palestine. There's nothing complicated about the horrors of and what apartheid does. It's not complicated. We know this. So it's our money. We're allowing our representatives to send it every single year and many, many times over, because it's not just once a year anymore. And I think we have to also realize that Americans receive a Zionist education. So if you talk to anybody in the street, if you say Palestine, half the time they won't know what you're talking about. Sometimes they'll confuse it with Pakistan. And if they do know anything, it will be about terrorism or war or something bad. If you say Israel, then they'll know exactly what you're talking about. They'll know about the Holocaust, the Jews, our friend, our ally, the Israeli military, how good they are, the Mossad, all that kind of, all that nonsense. That's because that's what they learn. That's what they learn in school. That's what Americans learn in school, and they see it in the movies, and they hear about it in the press, and their politicians, and so on. So this is the reality in which we exist. So is there any wonder that politicians end up supporting Israel? They grow up, they're raised to that. They're educated to that end, and it's not by accident. It wasn't random. The Zionists have been working tirelessly for 100 years or more than 100 years, long before the state was established, here in this country, to make sure that the education, culture, media, politics, everything goes in one direction, and there are no arguments. It's all completely, it's bipartisan. Everybody supports Israel because it's the right thing to do. So that's the reality in which we exist, and there's only one way to change it, and that's changing it. And that's us demanding that it change. No one's gonna, there's not gonna be some divine providence that comes down and helps us. This is it. There's not gonna be a candidate or a president. I always say there's no Salah ad-Din. It's not coming. Salah ad-Din is sitting in the room, right next to you. We are all Salah ad-Din. This is the only way it's going to change. So it's a terrible thing. Israel obviously knows how to play this game. The Zionists are investing billions of dollars to do this. They invested $17 million to make sure that Cori Bush is not elected. And by the way, we just started a collaboration working with her at Palestine House of Freedom. They spent another $18 or so million to make sure that Jamal Bauman loses. And they just allocated $150 million. Are there any students here? Okay, to make sure that you guys are silenced, to make sure to fight the anti-Semitism, quote unquote, on campuses. So this is the reality in which we exist, and it's up to us to stand up and change it.
Okay, I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay, so maybe briefly, a recent film called Israelism, produced by a group called If Not Now, a predominantly Jewish group, basically describes how large segments of the Jewish community, especially in the US, have effectively replaced their Judaism with an almost idolatry reverence for Israel and its ideology. Many pro-Israeli Jews would call you anti-Semitic. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, I reject the notion that there's such a thing as a Jewish community. There are many communities that are Jewish, but there's no such thing as a Jewish community. The Zionist community took it upon themselves to say that they are the Jewish community. And because they have big synagogues and a lot of money, they have the biggest bullhorns, so everybody hears them. So you see a synagogue, you see the big signs, we stand with Israel, and you go inside and there are Israeli flags. That is idolatry, by the way. But they're not the only Jewish community. And so I think that's one thing that's really important to understand. Now, what the Zionists did from very early on is they completely twisted what it means to be Jewish, which is why the most Orthodox, Most observant Jewish communities always rejected Zionism, and they still do. So the Zionists said, first of all, the Jews are not a religion. Being Jewish is not a religion, it's a nationality. Which is completely absurd, because Jews can be Yemenite, they could be Polish, they could be French, they could be Iraqi, they can be anything. The only common denominator is their faith. They don't eat the same food, they don't speak the same language, they don't live in the same country, they don't wear the same clothes. The only common denominator is their faith. They don't have the same skin color. I mean, there's nothing in common but the faith. The Zionists said, no, the faith is nonsense. We're the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, and we are a nation. Well, I don't know. If you look at the color of my skin, for example, I don't think I came from the Middle East. I don't think that I am a descendant of any tribe that came from that region. You know, so they invented this whole thing. Now, in the year 1900, so Zionism was really just beginning to exist. All the major rabbis of the time came out with a book which they disseminated among the communities. And this is 1900. There were very large Jewish communities still around the world. This is before World War II. And they said basically three things. This notion of a Jewish state is a danger to the Jewish people. It's going to bring violence to the Holy Land. It's going to ruin the good relations between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs. And it's going to cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jews in the countries in which they live. And one of the tenets of Judaism is to always be a good citizen in whatever country you live. Well, this was more than 100 years ago that they wrote this, and they were right on each and every one of those, right? I mean, they hit the mark on each and every one of those. So again, it's true, the Zionism is idolatry. And in fact, one of the things that the early Zionists claimed is that a Zionist is the opposite of a Jew. They couldn't describe what does it mean to be a Zionist, but they said what we see today in terms of Jews, and they're talking particularly about the Jews that lived in towns and what they call shtetls in Europe, they looked down at them. They wanted them to look like something else, like Greek gods or something, I don't know. And so that's what was created. So Zionism is idolatry, and it is a complete, it's a twisted version of what Judaism is really all about.
Yeah, whenever I speak at churches, I raise the analogy of if you care about a friend who's driving drunk, the right thing to do is to take away the keys. And, many Christian churches to which I'm invited are kind of reluctant to take a position critical of Israel because they care about their Jewish neighbors. And so I say, look, it's madness, total madness to think that what Israel is doing in that neighborhood is going to bring about peace or safety or security in the long run for anybody, including Israeli Jews. So clearly now, like Israel, the reigning ideology is that of extreme militarism. But do you think that this extreme militarism is likely to, is it possible that it is sustainable? Is that society, is such a hyper-militarist society sustainable in the long run?
Well, it all depends on what you mean sustainable or what you mean long run. It's been this way from the very beginning. Israel has been a racist, militarized, militant, and violent society from the very beginning. I mean, again, there are survivors of the Nakba sitting in this room, and second and third generation. So talk to them about what kind of society allowed that to happen on their watch and participated. And again, look at what's happening in Gaza now, and the society that's not only allowing it, but is participating willingly and supporting it, and even demanding that it continue. Now, how long it's sustainable, who knows? I don't think it's sustainable, but who knows? Israeli society, I view Israeli society as a bunch of different groups that are, bound together by Scotch tape. And the Scotch tape's falling apart. It's completely falling off, and so it's falling apart, and it's been happening for a very long time. Now, to sit back and expect it to disintegrate, I think would be a mistake. I think we need to do everything we possibly can to bring down the apartheid state, and I'm less concerned about Israeli society than I am about the safety and security and the well-being of Palestinians, because they are the ones who have been the victims and in many ways survivors of this reign of terror for the last 100 years. So how sustainable it is, I don't think it's sustainable. If there are fault lines, we should certainly take advantage of them. But again, I think the focus needs to be on the Palestinian people, on what they have to live through, and the reality in which Palestinians have existed, like I said, over 100 years now, living under this reign of terror. And nobody talks about the need to guarantee the safety and security of Palestinians. Palestinian life is worthless. You can buy a gun, or you don't need to buy a gun. You know, they gave all these licenses. You can get a gun very cheaply as an Israeli and kill a Palestinian in broad daylight, and there will be no consequences, certainly no bad ones. You might be hailed as a hero because you killed a terrorist. So that needs to be the conversation. We're talking about, you mentioned the ceasefire. How is it a ceasefire if they're still killing Palestinians in other parts of Palestine? What kind of a ceasefire is it that it's okay to keep killing the partner in the ceasefire? So they're pretending that, well, no, this is people in Gaza, this is people somewhere else, so it's not the same thing. What do you mean it's not the same thing? Are we out of our minds falling into this trap that it's not the same thing? So it's okay to kill them in Jenin, but as long as they stopped killing them for a short while in the Gaza concentration camp. And that's another thing. I think it's time to talk about Gaza as a concentration camp. In fact, now it's a death camp, but I think we need to use this language. I think it's important for people to realize that that's what Gaza Strip is. It was established as a concentration camp by Israeli society way back when the apartheid state was established. And what you need when you have a concentration camp is not relief. What you need is liberation. It needs to be dismantled. Right? We're talking about how much aid is coming in, how many trucks are coming in. Are we out of our minds? Dismantle the place and let people drive 10 minutes, 5 minutes away and buy food and water and take their kids to the hospital and get the medicine they need. People talk about that, these prison walls that surround the Gaza concentration camp as though they're immovable. They weren't there before 1950. There was no such thing as a Gaza Strip. There's no history to it. There's nothing. It was established as a concentration camp, and the focus needs to be on liberating it. Of course, people need help. They need after what they've been through. But the first thing that needs to happen is the liberation and free movement for Palestinians. Why are these people only allowed to go here? These people only allowed to go there? You're not allowed to go back to your home. You're not allowed to go to your family's home, and others here as well. Where's Matt, who's telling us how he went to knock on the door of the house that used to belong to his family, and they did a big favor, allow him to take a look, as long as he doesn't create a scene. And this is acceptable? This is okay? Never mind, people still have the keys and the deeds to their home. They're still alive, their homes are right there. So I think we need to elevate this conversation to a level that people understand what we're talking about. We're talking about a concentration camp. We're talking about a genocide. We're talking about a cruelty that should not be tolerated at all. And we have to talk about the rights of Palestinians to freedom, to liberty, to safety, to security, to raising their children, the things that we take for granted. That's where the conversation, I believe, needs to be.
So, I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions. One is the same film that I mentioned, Israelism, also shows, remember it's produced by, if not now, largely a Jewish group, also mentioned how very large numbers of young, especially young American Jews are fed up with Israel and have become very critical. How important is that? But more generally, how important is the growing solidarity movement in the U.S.? The U.S. anti-apartheid movement was not necessarily stronger than for South Africa than it was in other countries. But it was crucial in the decline of apartheid in South Africa, because here is the strongest country in the world, the leader of the so-called free world, and there was now the apartheid movement grew and was very powerful in shaking the South African apartheid system. Do you see something similar happening here?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I just want to mention one of the board members of Palestine House of Freedom, John Fussell. He's a retired lawyer from Connecticut. He was part of a committee in Connecticut that brought about the state of Connecticut to divest from South Africa way back when. And it wasn't easy. It took them many, many tries, but they were able eventually to do that. So it's a great lesson. I think in my view, we have seen two very interesting things develop parallel. One was in Palestine and one is here. And the one that was here is the heroism on college campuses. What we have seen on college campuses since October the 7th is heroic. It is one of the most heartwarming and encouraging expressions of humanity that I have ever seen. I've been to lots of those. I was fortunate enough to be able to see a lot of those encampments. The students that are here, can you raise your hands again? Those of you that are here? Yeah. The work that's being done on college campuses by students is the most important thing that is happening for the liberation of Palestine in this country, for sure. Without any question. They're being penalized, they're being punished, and they're back. In other words, they haven't slowed down. We saw all the way from Columbia to UCLA, we see students marching, we see students acting, we see students continuing. I was in Southern California at a university a few months ago to speak, and the student organizer, this very sweet 19-year-old, she's taking me from the parking lot to the venue, and as we're walking, she's all cheerful. She says, we've been banned. SJP has been banned. And we're not allowed, we can't get a venue, and we're not allowed to organize, and we're not allowed to host an event. And as we're walking, I said, so where are we going? Well, we walked, so because they had friends that work at a particular building, we got a hall about the size of this. Because they have friends who work in some of the campus restaurants, there was food for free. And because of the network that exists under the noses of the administration, there was a crowd like this of students. And this is with being banned. And as she's speaking to me, she's telling me that she couldn't graduate, which means she can't go to, grad school or whatever the case may be. They were penalized and punished and ostracized and beaten, not to mention beaten and shot in some cases. And they're back. They're not going to take no for an answer. They're not going to, lower their heads and disappear. So that is incredible. That is what is happening. That to me is more important than anything. Sure, it's great that young Jewish people feel differently about Israel. Of course, that's important. But I think that this is heroic. And the parallel is what we see in Palestine. The Israeli media, Israeli politicians, the discourse in the streets, which I follow very closely, they are blown away where they see Palestinians now in Gaza rebuilding, cleaning up. The police are making sure there's law and order. People are going back to the wreckage of their homes, and they're building, and they're back, and they have no intention of not building and not being back. And again, the horror of seeing these Palestinian heroes coming out of Israeli prisons, looking like skeletons, looking like shells of their former selves, and their families are celebrating, and and on the Israeli side, they're going nuts to see that. And again, we're seeing the spirit of Palestinians, which is undefeatable. And because they're undefeatable, they will not be defeated, and they're going to win, and Palestine will be free. But I think and by the way, since October 7th, you've experienced this, I'm sure, as many of you here in the audience. What was the first thing we were demanded of us to do every time we spoke of Palestine since October 7th? The first thing we were demanded to do is condemn. condemn the Palestinians for rising. What kind of madness is this? So the Palestinians living in this concentration camp for over almost 70, 75 years, they need to be condemned. The students who are rising and calling for justice, they need to be condemned. What kind of crazy is this? They're the ones who need to be condemned? That's crazy. The people that need to be condemned are the people that are causing the horrors in Palestine and the people who are trying to silence these brave students. That's who needs to be condemned. So to me, that is, really the story. Particular students, particular groups, Jewish or not Jews, joining this is of course wonderful, but really this is what to me the story really is.
So Miko, tell me what you think is the character of a just peace in Palestine. And so what should we be calling for? And what should we do to bring it about?
Let me say just one more thing about the previous statement. A great many of the students who were building the encampments and standing up for Palestine were Jewish anyway. So I mean, it's not like they're not there. It's funny. Did you just notice what happened here on the stage? A Palestinian who can't go back to his home is asking me what I view as the vision for a free Palestine. This is the kind of gracious character of Palestinians everywhere and anywhere. I think that the vision was created by Palestinians a long time ago. The platform was put in place by Palestinians decades ago. A free Palestine from the river to the sea with equal rights. I don't know that there's any other, there's no other option that I can see, and I do this a lot. And I've never seen a Palestinian who thought otherwise. So I mean, it's such a simple thing. Again, it's not complicated. It's not complicated. You remove the obstacle, which is apartheid. You remove this violent regime, and you allow for a real democracy with equal rights to emerge over all of historic Palestine. It's very simple.
So I have one advice for everybody in this regard. Join some group, join American Muslims for Palestine, be on the mailing list of my group, Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, Jewish Voice for Peace, Dar al-Hurriya, the House of Freedom for Palestine in DC. Join American Friends Service Committee, sign up for this apartheid-free communities. That's American Friends Service Committee, by the way, just so that you can get the action alerts, just so that you can continue being connected. That's how things start. Of course, the students are way ahead of us. God bless their heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question. There's a question over there. Raise your hand, please. You were first. Raise your hand.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I just had kind of a question in terms of, obviously the Trump administration has been especially targeting international students in terms of, if you post anything about Palestine or if you support Palestine, you're going to get deported. So I just wanted to see if you have any words of wisdom or something that we can do as international students that, we can still show our support but not get deported.
I have a very good friend. I don't have words of wisdom, but I have a friend I have some very wise friends, and so I'll quote one of my wise friends. I have a very good friend, one of my closest friends in Palestine. His name is Bassem Tamimi. And his family, they live in a small town, very small village called Nabi Saleh. I mean, it's so small that it's incredible to see what an impact, the strength of that village. And you probably remember his daughter, Ahid, with the big blonde hair that slapped a soldier and so on. And I have this conversation with him a lot because as a family, forget just the village or forget Palestinians in general, but just that family, the price that they paid children being killed, tortured, arrested, and it's just life. That's normal. And we talk about this a lot. I mean, how do you, he goes, well, we didn't ask for this, but we have no choice but to stand up. And when you stand up, you're going to pay a price. I think the expectation that we're going to stand up for what's right and not pay a price is really naive. There's going to be a price to be paid. Thankfully, if we live here, it's not that severe for most of us. If you're a student that's, risking being deported, not being able to finish education, that's obviously a heavier price. If you're Palestinian in Palestine and you're going to get shot, or even worse, your kids are going to be shot or tortured, that's certainly even worse. So we do the best we can. We align with our friends. We make sure that we protect one another, that we can trust one another, that we do everything we can so that people who stand up do not have to pay the price. And then we do our best. I mean, they're coming after everybody. And of course, the students are easy for them. But we have to stand up, and we have to stand up against these draconian measures as well. I don't know that there's a method particularly to prevent that, but you are you a foreign student? Where are you from? Okay, so yeah, that's a tough one. That's a really, really tough one. But if you're an activist and you stand up, then you stand that risk. And so it's a really, really tough call, and nobody really can make that decision but you.
There are groups like Palestine Legal and National Lawyers Guild who...
You're familiar with Palestine Legal? If you're not, then look them up. Palestine Legal, if anybody here doesn't know, is an organization that's dedicated to particularly helping students on these issues. And they are remarkable, and they're a nonprofit. And so I always tell people to donate to them because they do their work for free. And I've had 2 cases where they intervened, where students organized an event for me, and for some reason the school or somebody wanted to cancel. And as soon as they got a letter from Palestine Legal, they were like, oops, sorry, okay, you're back on, no problem. So they're that powerful. So definitely look up Palestine Legal and talk to them.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Miko. Appreciate your insight. First of all, I want to report something to everybody here. If you noticed yesterday on Signal and Facebook, I posted about the Palestinian, and she's an American citizen, that was detained, Shadin Kos, with no charges. The happy news is that she is out. They did not renew her detention. That happened today. The sad news, she didn't get to see her father. He died last night in a house fire. Until now, we don't know what caused that house fire. But having said that, this is the story of the Palestinians. I just want to reiterate what I always say and what Miko just reinforced, and that each and every one of us have a responsibility, and only we, each and every one of us, can decide what that responsibility is. But no one should be just an observer in order to achieve the goals that Miko talked about, and that is total liberation, an end to apartheid, an end to Zionism. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. We should not mince our words of talking about the nonsense of two-state solution. There never was a two-state solution. There never will be a two-state solution. There is only one state. If you drive in the West Bank, I am from the West Bank, Miko. I'm from the village of Bir Nabala. Bir Nabala to Jerusalem is 10 minutes by car. Now it's 2.5 hours, and for someone like me, maybe I'll be allowed in, maybe not. So it's a one state. It's an apartheid state. It's a racist state. We have to call it for what it is, and we cannot mince words. we have to be clear, just like Miko is, and just like Philip is. Thank you.
I'm now almost afraid to ask this because I walked in with maybe a shallow idea about a two-state solution, which I'm understanding that you're looking for something different from that, but it's not clear to me contextually, politically, what it looks like that you're asking for. Like, is it a sovereign Palestinian state where Israelis and Palestinians have the same rights? Is it something, what is this?
That's it.
What is this thing that
that's it.
holds these two, people together in equality and equity, justice? What does it look like?
Well, thank you for that question. And you're not alone, by the way. A lot of people assume that that's the solution, and if it's not that, then what is? And so I know, I talk to a lot of people who ask that question. And so Israelis, I would equate Israelis to the whites in South Africa. That's what Israelis are. Whites in South Africa are the descendants of colonizers and settlers and racists, but now they're part of South Africa. They're part of the landscape. Israelis are the children and grandchildren of settlers and so forth, colonizers, racists. But now you have 6 million Israelis, and they are part of the landscape of Palestine. So a free Palestine is, yes, it's a sovereign country whose boundaries are the historical boundaries of Palestine, which is from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, east-west, from the boundaries in the north with Syria and Lebanon to the Gulf of Aqaba and then in the south. That's historic Palestine with equal rights. Now, it seems insane to expect that would happen. But if we sat here and today was 1988 or 1989 and somebody suggested that apartheid would fall within 5 years and Nelson Mandela would be president of South Africa, it would seem an absolutely insane thing to say. So these things happen when we least expect them sometimes, although in hindsight, there are always signs. So rather than wait and say, ooh, how did that happen, what I think is useful to do is to make it happen. We've seen it happen. We've seen racist regimes, dictatorships fall, apartheid in South Africa fall, legalized apartheid in this country, in the South fall. We've seen these things happen, so we know what the playbook is. And in many ways, perhaps the South African example is a good one because we're talking about dismantling a regime that is an apartheid regime. And if anybody has any doubt, about 3 years ago, Amnesty International came out with a report. It's an excellent report on apartheid in Palestine and demonstrates all the different ways in which the crime of apartheid is taking place, exists within Palestine. And then it is dismantled, and then you call for one person, one vote elections to a central legislature, and that would be the first time ever in Palestine that there was such a thing. And every vote counts, and so everybody votes. And then you have a legislature, and then you have an executive, and then you start working on a constitution, and you release the prisoners. And what's interesting in South Africa, some of us are old enough to remember when President de Klerk stood up, and then he won the Nobel Prize, even though he didn't do it out of love. He did it because South Africa was on its knees. South Africa was finished. South Africa went from controlling all of southern Africa, all the way up, and had to be thrown out of Angola by Cuba, who came to save the day and help, to nothing. And they had gold, uranium, and nuclear weapons, and America and Israel in their back pocket. And they were done. If you hosted an event and invited a South African delegation, you would be penalized. It was that serious. Forget the Olympics, forget sports, forget international gatherings, culture, forget it. They couldn't do anything and trade. So then he stood up and he said, we are unbanning all of the political parties. We are releasing the political prisoners, leading with Nelson Mandela. And we're calling for a one-person, one-vote election on a particular date. not 10 years from now, but in a particular, and that was the end of apartheid. Now, South Africa had 40 million impoverished black Africans who were never allowed to go to school, who were deprived of the right to go to school. Palestine doesn't have that. In Palestine, we have two highly educated societies. We have terrible poverty and horrible conditions for Palestinians because of the apartheid, not because of a lack of education or creativity or or being industrious. So that is the vision. One step, two step, three step, and then you have a free Palestine from the river to the sea, and then you can start solving the problems. Then you talk about reparations. And there's a book that just came out, Stolen Land, which I recommend. It's a very good book. It's about the reparations for the survivors of 1948. And then you talk about putting in place mechanisms for the refugees to return. And again, refugees are not only people living in refugee camps. Refugees are people sitting in this room who are not allowed to return. That's the vision. That's what we're talking about. Or the other option is you leave things as they are. There is no third option, really.
I've got a question. I think it's important for me to speak because I'm probably part of the problem. I'm a WASP, and I was raised in the Midwest, and I was very sympathetic to Israel all along because of the Holocaust, because in the '67 war, it was all these Arab states wanting to destroy the Israeli state. I said, oh my God, we got to do something about that. And then we have Iran. I mean, all these calls for the abolishment of Israel. Well, I became sympathetic, like many of us WASP-type people, with the sympathy. I'm sympathetic to Israel because of my history. Now, I have never heard Gaza described as a concentration camp. And you are saying that if anybody needs to be condemned, it shouldn't be the Gaza people. It should be Israel. Now, the only point, if I'm talking about Israel to my friends, and everybody says, what do you think is going on in Gaza? They will tend to think, okay, Israel's overdoing it, for sure, but they will point out that on October 7, Hamas came into Israel, decapitated people, killed innocents, took all these hostages. They behaved like barbarians. Now, how am I gonna, what do you say about that? Is there, you can't approve that, but I want to be on your side. I belong to another Unitarian church, and the social action people are very much pro-Palestinian. They see this genocide. But then there's always these people say, well, look what they did, on October 7th. They should be punished. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the other side is very good at putting out their information and branding what happened and branding Palestinians. And there's very little counter from the other side. So everything we know about Palestine has been branded by the Zionists and by the Zionists. In fact, that's another challenge that we're dealing with Palestine House of Freedom, is we're working to rebrand and find a way to, brand what a free Palestine is and how people view it, this idea of a free Palestine. But again, the desire, Philip said that, the desire to pretend that everything started on October 7th, it's very easy to pretend, but that's not the case. 2 million Palestinians have been living in a concentration camp, denied access to their homes and their land, denied access to travel at all, denied access to food, water, medicine, and bombed on a regular basis going back to the early 1950s. So on October the 7th, Palestinian fighters came out. Now, on top of that, Israel has been holding over 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails, unwilling to release them, going through horrendous torture like we heard, and Philip, like he said, it was relatively short, but still the torture and the arrest without, administrative arrest without charges and so on. So people say, yeah, but what they did was terrible. Well, so on October the 7th, Palestinian fighters came out, now from one of the poorest and most oppressed regions in the world, okay? Outside of the Gaza Strip, there's a state, a very rich state, with support from the rest of the world, with a massive army, with all the military hardware you could possibly imagine, with all the most sophisticated intelligence you could possibly imagine, the most high-end, cutting-edge technology that you can possibly imagine, and a bunch of guys from the Gaza Strip, where a glass of water is a luxury, came out. So let's put things in perspective here. Now, they came out and they managed, well, let me say this. First of all, they didn't come out into Israel. They went into places where their homes are originally. Most of the refugees in Gaza, their homes are right outside the concentration camp in southern Palestine. That's where they came from. So they went back to their land, back to their homes, back to where they belong. They liberated they held on to about 20 different settlements. They completely paralyzed the apartheid state. This entire massive military complex, this entire massive, sophisticated intelligence system was caught off guard. The military base that was supposed to protect Israeli settlers from an attack from Gaza was taken over by these guys, right? Hold on. Now, the declared objective of taking the hostages was to be able to do a release, an exchange, a prisoner exchange. The violence, the shooting, the indiscriminate killing of civilians, if not all, then certainly the vast majority was done by Israeli forces. And if you listen to, and this is coming from Israeli sources. No, it's not, of course not. Of course not. There's a movie that was just made, an excellent documentary. I'm not sure where you can find it, but I just saw it in DC, that was made by a journalist by the name of Max Blumenthal. He's a Jewish journalist. And he made a documentary about what happened on October the 7th. And the Israeli military have this thing called the Hannibal Directive, where you kill the civilians so they won't be taken hostage. And the estimated number of Israelis killed by Israeli fire is at least 800. When you look at the cars that were burned, you look at the helicopters, how the helicopter pilots admitted to shooting indiscriminately, to killing indiscriminately. The Israeli commanders in the settlements, in Kibbutz Be'eri and others, admit, and this was known because there were witnesses, they shot into buildings with hostages. So, and now the former Israeli Minister of Defense, Gallant, also admitted this, that they put in place the Hannibal Directive. The vast majority of the killing was done by the Israeli forces. Number one, Palestinians didn't have that kind of firepower. Number two, they came with a very clear mission to take hostages and bring them back. And then when you listen to interviews by some of the fighters who were there and went back to Gaza, they'll say, there was no intention to get into all this massive shooting and fighting. The intention was to take them, as many hostages as possible, bring them back, and then begin a negotiation, which, by the way, these hostages could have been released right there and then. They didn't have to stay in tunnels in Gaza all this time. But Israel was not interested. So the core of your question is, how do we come back with what has actually happened when the other side's narrative is in all the mainstream media, it's being repeated by politicians, it's being repeated by president after president, they're talking about beheaded babies and rape and all kinds of nonsense. There's no evidence to any of it whatsoever, and all the evidence shows very clearly that the vast majority, if not all, clear the vast majority of the killing was done by the Israeli forces, and this is something that has happened in the past. This is, sorry? No, of course not. It's not publicized. There's a reason for it. We are. So, like I said,
The
I'm doing everything I can.
decapitation story, there is I'll give you my email, and there's so much evidence. But one particular story, the decapitation, the only there's this group, I forget their name, the religious people who pick. So he was talking to a BBC interviewer and showing him on his phone what he claimed was decapitated babies. And the BBC guy says, I don't see decapitated babies. He says, yeah, you don't see it, but it happened. That's all.
Look up Max Blumenthal and the documentary he just
And
made
I'll
about
give you
this.
my contact information. I'll send you a whole bunch of stuff. But I have more to say about that too, and we'll talk. Please wait.
Thanks for your talk. I just want to, myself, my interest is in Islamic eschatology and epistemology, and I've been working with my Jews and Christian colleagues for about 10, 13 years. 2 years back, I was invited by the Holy Church of Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and I also visited the city of King David, and I had a meeting with the Council of the Jewish Rabbi, and we were discussing all these things. I just want to have a very simple question. A few weeks back, we have a discussion with Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Professor John Merchama, just you know. My question is, what do you see in the next 5 years? I mean, I'm not sure you have talked about, but what do you see? I mean, the circumstances which are present right now, what these things are going to lead us to in the next 5 years?
Well, what I think we should, if we all do if we all do everything we possibly can, then I think in the next 5 years there's going to be a sea of change in this country. And the sea of change in this country is what's going to lead to change in Palestine. And so our objective, again, at Palestine House of Freedom is to completely change the discourse on Palestine. Today, you have a bipartisan agreement to support Israel, with a few voices that are a little bit weakening, but by and large, it's a bipartisan support of Israel. That needs to be completely reversed, 100%. Completely reversed. So the only conversation that's acceptable, and by the way, that happened with South Africa too. One day it was okay to support this brutal regime that targeted black Africans. The next day, you could not say that anymore. That's the process that we are working on here in this country. We need to completely we need to create a reality where it is completely unacceptable to support Zionism or support the state of Israel, that it's not a question of if, but a question of when and exactly how. In other words, a question of details of the apartheid regime being replaced by a real democracy with equal rights. That's where we need to be, hopefully before 5 years, but I think 5 years is definitely a realistic expectation.
Everything started declining in South Africa. So my question is, do you expect similar things happening from the United States? Somebody firm hand going to?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for taking questions. I bought both of your books. I'm interested in knowing about the General's son. So if you can take
Can you
a minute,
put it closer to your mouth?
Yeah, I bought both of your books, and I'm interested in knowing more about your dad. How long ago did he die? What was his thought toward the end? What did he feel about you and about Israel and Palestine? I'll probably read it in here, but maybe you could tell us while you're here.
Yeah. So what made my father unique in a way is that at the end of the 1967 war, a war that he pushed very hard to start, and he was one of the generals who planned it and executed it and led it. so the last day of the war, the 5th day of the war, the first meeting of the Israeli High Command, and by the way, it was a 5-day war, not a 6-day war. They call it 6 days. Anybody want to guess why? The biblical connection, the days of creation, the miracle, that sort of thing. If you look at the Jewish scriptures, 6 days of creation, the miracle of the 6 days of creation is repeated over and over and over and over in the Jewish prayer books and so forth. And so and to this day, people who don't believe in miracles say that that was a miracle, even though there was nothing miraculous about it. It was a very well planned and executed assault by Israel against its neighbors. But he stood up and he said, on the first meeting of the Israeli High Command at the end of the war, he stood up and he said, we now have an opportunity to make peace. We can allow the Palestinians to have their own state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They can have East Jerusalem. We can keep West Jerusalem. And then we can make peace with the rest of the Arab countries and we're done. We can move on. And two things happened as he was saying this. The first thing that was happening is Israeli bulldozers were destroying Palestinian towns and cities and neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and building massively for Jews only, which is, of course, what they did in other parts of Palestine up to that point. And the second thing, he was taken aside by his comrade saying, well, what are you talking about? Why do you talk like this? We just got everything that we deserve. This is all ours. Why would you want to give it back to anybody? Why would you want to talk to the Arabs? And he said, because if we don't, we're going to end up with a binational state that it won't be the Jewish state. Well, nobody cared. And so for the rest of he retired from the military about a year later and embarked on an academic career. And he dedicated the rest of his life to this idea of what we know today as the two-state solution, which of course nobody wanted to talk about, not within the state of Israel, not within the Israeli establishment. And that was his legacy. He died shortly after the Oslo Accord were signed. So there was a sense of maybe there was something going to happen. But the very last article that he wrote, and he had a column in the Israeli papers, was Requiem to Oslo. He said, Israel does not want peace. Rabin, who just got the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, is not interested in peace. The Oslo Accords will only deepen and strengthen the occupation. They will do nothing for Palestinian independence. And that was it. And I was not really active on this issue at that time till much later. So, but that was his legacy. That was his, the trajectory of his life.
One more question.
Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm a little nervous because, when you start hearing things and it just drives up your anxiety. And just to respond to the two-state solution thing. I'm Native American, and I'm from the Nottoway tribe of Virginia, specifically the Jedwehaaga. If you want to know the history of what it's like for Palestinians, just look at the history of the United States of America. I am one of the very few descendants of our people that are left. There are 500 people in my tribe. A two-state solution is exactly what happened in the United States, right? We have reservations in which they diminish and steal our land even more so than they ever have. We have almost nothing left and are almost completely wiped out. And people live here and forget they live on stolen land every day. Two-state solutions will never work. It must be ruled by Palestine, as it always should have. We are fair people as oppressed groups of people. And for anyone that doesn't understand or know, I really encourage you to do a lot of heavy reading into the history of settler colonialism in this country and see how very few Native people exist around you right now and what it's like for us, just like Palestinians. Just wanted to respond to that. I'm very grateful to be here with everyone and to support Palestine, free Palestine all the way.
I want to just say thank you so much for that. That was so true. And I don't know what else needs to be said after that. You really nailed it. And this happened to me once before. I was in Arizona. I was in, I think it was Albuquerque, University of Arizona. No, not Albuquerque, I'm sorry, Phoenix. And at the end of the program, somebody stood up who was a Native American and made a very similar statement. And so you really nailed it. Thank you.
And if you read a lot of the writings of the original colonists in the US, it is so incredibly similar to the writings of the early Zionist leaders. Many American religious people, in the name of religion, settled this country to build Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem shining on the hill. Same with South Africa, the whites going to South Africa. Same in Australia, same in other locations that are settler colonial. The ideology almost reads the same. You could just replace the name Palestine with, any of these countries.
Thank you, sir, for taking my question, and thank you for being here. My question is in relation to the history of South Africa, which you brought up and mentioned, and I just want to bring it to Palestine. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission before democracy was happening. So my question is, it's hypothetical, is there anyone about that and internationally speaking about that happening for Israelis and Palestinians? About where like Desmond Tutu did, because I know mainstream media has a blockage on all that. If there is, who would be leading it, or what kind of group would be leading it? And if there isn't, would you be willing to lead something like that yourself?
Well, I think again the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was quite genius, because we know that in most cases, trying to pursue war criminals through a justice system is practically impossible. I think it happened once successfully. There's just a movie that just came out, which I strongly recommend. It's called Argentina 1985. And they had brought this was maybe a year or two after the dictatorship fell, and a prosecutor was able to put to trial and convict several of the generals who were responsible for the horrors of that military dictatorship. But certainly the Truth and Reconciliation was a good idea, because it allowed for that cleansing and allowed for people to be. It was kind of an alternative to prosecution. I think it's a bit early for that. I mean, I would certainly love to see Israeli generals and politicians led to The Hague after they are tried by Palestinians. I think the first dibs need to be Palestinians prosecuting these criminals, and then they need to be sent to The Hague. But this requires a political reality that doesn't exist yet. And so as soon as it does, I think we're going to need some really good lawyers to put that process in place. But thank you for that. I agree. It's a very important thing.
Thank you both very, very much. I've heard you speak in Albany, New York, Washington, D.C. I followed you everywhere. But my question, I feel, is important for the man who said he was a WASP, and what does he say to people? And I get that question, too, about, look at the violence started by Hamas on that day. But would you please speak to us and tell us, refresh our memory, and maybe educate some people here, how the Palestinians a few years before then tried peaceful demonstrations behind the fence in Gaza and were massacred in various ways. Would you please recount some of that? Because to me, that shows that they have no chance to do it peacefully.
Right. People always accuse Palestinians of not being peaceful enough. And so, but that's a very good point, so thank you for that. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance historically has always been unarmed. Palestinians don't have an army. Palestinians never had an army. Palestinians have never had a tank, or a warplane, or a helicopter, or really anything that resembles a military. And people like to see, the show of force that we see in Gaza, the Palestinian, resistance in their uniforms and their guns. That's not an army. It's not an army. These are guerrilla fighters. And as, heroic as they might look or scary as they might look, they're not an army. Now, we should all remember the Gaza March of Return, where Palestinians were massacred, wholesale as they were marching, wanting freedom. And in fact, Ahmed Abu Rutema, who is the brains behind the Gaza March of Return, who's a writer and a poet and a wonderful man, who I've known for a very long time, is a founding member of Palestine House of Freedom. And he and I discussed this for a very long time. And he lost his son, his family was killed, many members of his family was killed. Thankfully, he's still alive. He's in Gaza. But, going back, in 2005, the Palestinians embarked, in the West Bank particularly, and East Jerusalem, embarked on what was known as the Popular Resistance, which were these peaceful marches in, Bil'ain, the city, the town of Bil'ain, and then Abi Saleh, and then a bunch of others joined, and that was like a ritual. And every activist under the sun would go and, check off that they went to Bil'ain or went to Abi Saleh to participate in these things. And the violence that they were met with was horrendous by the military. And then after it was over, the next day, the military would raid the village and arrest people and arrest children and torture and so on and so on. This was going on for years, and still they did it for as long as they could. So they resist through culture, and Palestinians resist through academia, and the Palestinians resist by existing, and Palestinians resist in every way they possibly can, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the other side is a violent, racist, genocidal regime, and it doesn't work. The day that Palestinians came out of the Gaza Strip on October the 7th, they were able to shut it down. They were able to paralyze this monstrosity of this genocidal regime, was confused, scared, and dysfunctional. And to this day, they're not quite functioning quite that well as a result of that trauma. So if you're Palestinian or not Palestinian, all of us, some of us here are old enough, we remember all kinds of freedom fighters, the partisans and the people who fought against fascism in Spain. And, in our lifetime, Spain was a fascist dictatorship. And so was Greece and Portugal and Latin America and on and on and on and on. And we always stood for who? We always stood for the resistance. Nobody ever said, no, condemn them first. That is only saved for Palestinians. You have to condemn them first. Well, how much longer do they need to die in their beds before they're allowed to stand up and fight? How much longer? Another 100 years? How many more children have to die? How many more children have to starve? Children starving in Palestine? Children dying from dehydration in Palestine? Children dying from simple infection in Palestine, where you have some of the best medical facilities and always had historically, and plenty of food and water? Are we out of our minds? These people need to be condemned after all they've been through and all the attempts to negotiate and dialogue and understand the other side? How much longer? And look what happened. These people came out of one of the poorest, more oppressed places in the world without an army. And they shut it down. That's what we asked them to do. What do we say in protests? If we don't get it, shut it down. Well, they shut it down. And they need to be condemned? Are we out of our minds? That's the response. I was asked once in an interview by a student, or an event like this, what to say, well, how do I explain the fact that I won't condemn the Palestinians for October 7? And I said, condemn them for what? And they couldn't answer. Condemn them for what? For the lies that the other side is telling about them? And I got into a lot of trouble immediately after October 7th when I completely refused to accept the stories that are coming out from the Israeli side, including my own family. They stopped talking to me. I refused to accept it. And today we know that they were all lies. But regardless of what they said, we can see, there's a history. There's a history of almost 100 years. And Palestinians stood up and they succeeded. Of course, they had to pay a heavy price, but Palestinians always pay a heavy price. They pay a heavy price whether they try or whether they stay in their beds.
I'd like to add something to this. So, in the history of oppressed people, there has always been acts that the oppressed have done that were not, there was killing of civilians. For example, the Nat Turner Rebellion. Is everybody familiar with that? The fights that Geronimo and his Apaches, I think, conducted in the south of this country. The Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. India was not only Gandhi. There was also Subhas Chandra Bose and many other Indian leaders who asked for violent resistance and practiced it, and sometimes even killed English civilians. Does that mean that I don't stand with the people of India fighting for liberation? That I don't stand with slaves who are seeking freedom in this country? My group and many other, like Miko said, in all these cases, all cases where oppressed people were fighting, mostly their fights were nonviolent. Mostly their fights were nonviolent because they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the military might. And in some cases, they had to resort to violence. MLK, when he spoke at the Riverside Church, he actually quoted, of all people, John F. Kennedy, who said, I don't remember the exact words, but he said, if you don't have room for nonviolent resistance, then the only alternative is violence. What we are saying today is that we ought to stand in solidarity so that we will prevent the ugliest forms of the Palestinians are going. Israel cannot be sustained. I asked Miko this question, but in my opinion, this hyper-military society cannot be sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable. The question is how much violence is there going to happen before it disappears? And what we are trying to do is to prevent the ugliest path towards that liberation.
Thanks. I know we're right at 4 o'clock. If we have one more question, though. That's right.
Thank you. This has been an incredible afternoon, and I appreciate you both for being here. You've spoken a lot about apartheid in Israel. So thank you so much. So can you please help us understand the parameters of apartheid by explaining some of the Israeli law that are created to legally oppress the Palestinians that are referred to, for example, the ownership of land, where the Jewish National Fund started 30 years before the creation of the State of Israel, and how they were able to hold on to land. And then in 1949, how Israel was able to take all the land as a Jewish state so that nobody owns any land in Israel, only the state. And can you also talk about things like the nation-state law and how that discriminates against Palestinians but gives certain rights to the Israelis, which will help us understand that the apartheid is just a word, but when we understand the laws that are being enacted and carried out, for example, first-class citizenship in Israel, how do you get that? Why are Mizrahi Jews second and third-class citizens versus Ashkenazi Jew? Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews are Semites. Ashkenazi Jews are European. So the whole question of then Semitism and and let me just say, Arabs, I'm an Arab, we're Semites, yet anti-Semitism laws don't seem to affect us either. So there's this contradictory confusion that helps Americans get really confused. Can you talk a little bit about Israeli law and how that supports apartheid?
Sure, yeah, great point. So this is going to take a while. It's a bit of a, you have to stay with me because it gets a little complicated. So this is how the Israeli apartheid, the Zionist apartheid works. And again, there's an Amnesty report if you want more detail. I'll give you kind of the broader strokes. As an Israeli Jew, you can live anywhere throughout historic Palestine and you're a full-fledged citizen, and it's like you're living in a liberal democracy. Civil law, you have the rights, there's law that protects you, and so on, regardless of where you live throughout all of historic Palestine. If you're Palestinian, what determines the particular laws that govern your life is where you live specifically, geographically. And Israel does not allow you to transfer from one geographic area to another because you have a specific status and a specific form of ID that identifies you as belonging to that particular part of the country. Oh, so far so good, you with me? So, if you are a descendant of 1948, of what became Israel in 1948, you have this quasi-Israeli citizenship. But it's not the same as the citizenship that any Israeli Jew has, because the laws that govern your existence are different. And generally speaking, your life is controlled by the Israeli intelligence services. So if you want to be a teacher or a doctor or, I don't know, go to college or get a mortgage or open a bank account or get a driver's license, everything is governed first. You have to go through the Israeli intelligence services. Now, there's a separation between the 1948 Palestinians, whether they live in the northern part of the country or if they live in the Naqab, which is the entire southern part of the country. The Palestinian Bedouins, about 300,000 of them who live in the southern part of the country, the Naqab, the authority that governs them is called the Authority or the Bureau for the Development of the Negev. Development is a code word that means taking away Palestinian lands, destroying their homes, and making sure that they have no rights. And you have, out of those 300,000 Palestinian Bedouin, at least 200,000 that live in abject poverty, no access to water, roads, schools, and on and on and on and on and on. Citizens of the state of Israel. Now, I'll say one more thing about the Naqab because it's important. The Naqab is a very fertile desert. Okay, the settlements in the Naqab enjoy some of the highest standards of living among Israelis, Jews. It's that fertile. It's very rich. The settlements in the Naqab are very rich. Now, Palestinian Bedouin were traditionally farmers. They were semi-nomadic. Today, they are not permitted to engage in agriculture. If I went back tomorrow and I wanted to open a ranch or a farm in the Naqab, I would get the land, I would get subsidized water, I would get everything I need, I would get tax exemptions, and I could open, I don't know, whatever I wanted. Agricultural farm. Palestinians, and you see the Israeli settlement, sometimes, again, across the street, really beautiful, wealthy communities, across the street from abject poverty, lack of jobs, crime, everything that comes with that reality, across the street from each other. So this is just the Naqab. Now, so that's kind of the broad stroke of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now you've got the Palestinians who are in Jerusalem. Some Palestinian families in Jerusalem, and Philip knows this better than I, have a history in the city that goes back 500, 800 years. Same family. They have an alien resident card, and they have to keep proving, in order to maintain that status, they have to keep proving that Jerusalem is the center of their life. Now, if I went back to Jerusalem tomorrow, I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I can go back and live in Jerusalem tomorrow. Nobody's going to ask me where my center of life is. My status is not, I have a citizen, they don't even have a citizenship. Because, of course, they're Palestinians. And they can lose it like that. In other words, Palestinians lose, you lost your Jerusalem ID, right? Palestinians lose their Jerusalem ID all the time. And that's the objective. And their homes are being taken, and their land is being taken, and their property is being taken, and so on. Then you've got the Palestinians in the ghettos, are you with me so far? In the ghettos of what used to be the West Bank, and they live under military dictatorship, and that is divided into areas A, B, and C. And then you have got the concentration camp of Gaza. All right? Each one of these has its own bureaucracies with its own laws that change all the time. More and more and more laws to discriminate against Palestinians are passed by the Israeli legislature and the Israeli military all the time. One that was passed, I don't want to get into details, but this one is particularly crazy. So if a Palestinian rapes a Jewish woman, the penalty is 3 times harsher than if a Jewish man rapes a Jewish woman. Because when a Palestinian does it, there's an element of terrorism to it. That's the rationale. These are the kinds of laws that are being passed by the Knesset, by the Israeli legislature, just so you understand. So that kind of, in broad strokes, demonstrates the Israeli apartheid, just how sophisticated it is.
Great. Thank you, Philip and Miko, for coming.
Which is why it needs to be dismantled, by the way. That's why it needs to be dismantled.
And I just want to say we have, a couple years ago now, it's been 2 years, Richmonders for Peace in Israel Palestine held a symposium over 3 days virtually on the one-state solution. Oh, right. And that is, the videos are available on YouTube at, I think it's ARPIP_RVA, if you're interested in learning more about the one-state solution.
Miko was there.
Yeah.
I was there.
So there's lots of information.
And get the books, get the books.
Yeah, and the books are out in the hall.
And get one of these cards if you have a mosque or a church or any community that might be interested in taking the American Friends Service Committee group called Take a Pledge Against Apartheid. Apartheid-free communities. Yeah, who wants, yeah, but not everybody. I don't know.